Welcome, everyone, and welcome to our CMC 2.0 introduction. This has been exciting times, and we have a lot of things that are happening. Title 32 just became law on the Tuesday, so that was the long-awaited CMC brochure that came through. Just to kind of show everyone what the status is, I'll show you in a second. My name's Matt Katzer. I'm the CEO of KAMIND IT. We are basically just completed our CMC pretest. We're scheduled for our full certification in January 13th, so it's going to be a fun time. I'm also a CCP. And just to kind of put everything in perspective, what's going on is we have Title 32 published in the Federal Register. Here's a copy of it with the effective date. So this will become law on basically December 16th. So that's kind of the date to have. And there's really two acts to us, and I'll get more about what the timeline and what the impact is to the community and what we have to do. So it's a very, very interesting time. So this presentation, we're not going to go into the deeps of CMMC. This is mostly talking about what's changed and what do we need to do and how do we actually manage the change and how do we actually handle and make sure that we're doing the right things that we're supposed to do. For those who don't know KAMIND IT, we're basically a Office 365, a direct Microsoft partner. We're also an AOSG partner. We provision both GCC High and Azure Government. And this is really important when you look in terms of Azure Government, how it's provisioned, because the Azure Government subscriptions, the subscriptions is actually a CUI asset. So they have to be provisioned in such a way that they're owned by the tenant. And this is very much important when you look at the new Title 32 rules. And I'll get into more of that in a few minutes. Basically, and what we do a lot of different things for our clients. We do managed cybersecurity services, both in commercial and in Azure Government under CMMC. We're also going through a compliance service, so ourselves getting CMC L2 compliant. We just completed our pretest. And we actually use FeatureFeed as our GRC tool for data collection. We also provide managed services, for instance, for those customers that actually need it, among licensing and other compliance activity. And we also use a lot of our terms of tools of what we do internally. There's a lot of discussion about how you check the checkers. And we have a tool called Guard Plus that we actually develop. It's available in the Azure Marketplace for commercial. It's under an SOW for a statement of work for the government sector. But we use that to actually check on and make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. We also have other clients that actually use it to actually validate what their MSSP is actually doing to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And this is really important in this day of age because the amount of events that we generate for security events, dailies, even for ourselves, are in the tens of millions. And it's really, really important that basically you actually have multiple tools to look at this and make sure you see what's going on. A little basis, when you look at CMC and managed security, it's foundational. And this is really important. And this is what's more important as we talk about the changes in Title 32. It really is a foundational, and that's why the approach is taken. And when you look in terms of managed security is that piece of software. Everything that you look at in terms of like Title 32 and what the NIST 800-171 is doing, it's really trying to address how you actually manage security from yourself inside the organization and how you deal with that MITRE, the MITRE kill chart that we see on the left. And this is really crucial because the whole purpose of actually how you actually handle and look in terms of security is based around some standards and some approach. And this is really what drives the approach and the structure. So when you look in terms of whatever implementation you're doing, if you're doing Microsoft or you're doing another implementation, a chart like this for your security supplier, your security protection assets that you actually are using are necessary to make sure that you meet the qualifications of, the compliance. And that's really what we actually are talking about today. And so we're not going to talk more about what KAMIND doing. We're going to talk more about what Title 32 is and really what the effective date is. And put it in perspective what you have, because right now, today, There's really two documents. There are two, Title 32 CFR and the Code of Federal Register is now effective as a law. You also have another one known as Title 48. And Title 48 is what the contract officers use. And that's actually this week is really the last time you actually can make feedback in terms of that, in terms of what the laws are changing. And the way this actually works is Title 32 is what we need to do. It's about the structure. It's about what we have to do from an organization. How do we have to make our environment secure? And how do we actually put those pieces into it? Now, it's really interesting because it's trying to establish this guidelines for established agencies and executive departments. So it's much more far-reaching than we may think. So as we go see as the government try to put more cybersecurity standards in place, they need to pick something, and they need to pick something where there's actually regulators and assessors in the market that actually can handle it. When you look at Title 48, Title 48 is what the contract officers do, and that's how the contracts are actually implemented. So there are really two parts of it. So you got to be compliant, which is Title 32. And in order to get awards, that's what the contract officers use, and that's how they dictate in terms of both for FAR and DFAR's requirements in terms of how awards are actually given. So you look at this whole process of these things run hand in hand. And the biggest question that we're always asked is the timeline. And the timeline is really crucial on this. For 32 CFR Title 32, it effective is 10/15/2024. That's when it was published in the Code of Federal Register. And the effective date that you have to implement it becomes law is really on the 16th of December. So that's kind of where we are now. So this has been we started this process in early 2020, and here we are today. So it's been a long road. There've been a lot of changes with versions of it and different types of features that's been added that we've seen through time. Now, the other piece on this is going to be Title 48. Like Title 48 is what the contract officers do. Now, the way the current draft is written, they have this little notion is that they want to have 500 contracts basically deployed. And what they did, the big change that they had when they actually looked at Title 48 is they structured at a minimum of 500 contracts. Previously, it was at least 500 contracts. And that's a big nomenclature difference because it could be 600, it could be 700. And when you look at the number of contracts, it may seem, well, okay, that's much. There's 300,000 DIBs out there. There really is only about 1,500 contracts in the Defense Department. And then when you look at those 1,500 contracts, those feed into over 300,000 entities that service them. So think of 1,500 prime contracts and all the subcontracts. This could be bearings for, different types of hardware, gaskets, whatever. So a lot of things happen. So we can look at that. So what does it mean for you? So if you look at this timeline, for instance, 32 CFR is basically law on 12/16/2024. We're doing our own third certification. I'm sure each of you have your own certification schedules. Ours is January 13th. We expect Title 48, that's the rules for the contract officers, to basically drop around June 15th. That's where it becomes effective. Now, and then I put this other mark here in red. And what's happening is there's something known as a Paperwork Reduction Act. And in the older time, a couple of years ago, what's happened is when you would actually put a bid in for a contract and be notice of award and the award is actually given, the difference between the notice and when the award is actually granted, you could be up to 10 months to a year. Under the Paperwork Reduction Act, this is 90 days. So what you're seeing now is that if you're looking at if you're a sub, for instance, you're going to see the contract officers give notice out around June 15th, maybe August, maybe July, or maybe May in that time period. And then they're going to notify the primes. The primes are then going to contact the subs And the subs are going to have to tell what their compliancy, what their schedule, are they certified? And the dates of those things are going to happen is round about basically December 15th is where you have to have the certification on some of the contracts. So you may have expectations to be certified by that time. So you have to keep in mind. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this works out, but pay attention to what's happened. So you need to kind of step back and look at the various pieces and basically make sure it's not, and don't think that this is not going to affect you. It is going to affect you. And it's going to be very interesting to see how this actually hits in terms of the marketplace and what's in terms of the contract. But our tea leaves right now saying that if you're involved in a lot of contracts or if you have received notice of what your schedule is, you have a very limited window. You have roughly about a year to get yourself into the queue for certification. And there's not very many C3POs for certification. But, let's go, before we actually look at those issues, let's go talk about what's really changed. And it's been really interesting looking at 32 CFR and seeing the changes on it. And it really came down to a lot of definition clarification. For instance, they define what's a cloud service provider, what's the assessment codes, came up what is the external service provider. They also removed MSP and MSSP from the Title 32. They define what's not applicable in terms of the standards. What's a security protection asset? This is the one that people were worried about because security protection assets, the way they were defined, had a lot of implications, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. They came up with a new term called security protection data, clarified out of scope what VDI is, and also the new one, which is very interesting, it's a data retention requirements, which is going to have impact in terms of how you manage your SSP and how you manage your artifacts to show proof of execution. So what I want to do is we're just going to go through some of these definitions, and it's important to really understand these definitions and understand what's important. And at the end, there's really three things you got to remember after we get through our discussion. When we talk about CSP, what we're talking about is what we call the cloud service provider. In this case, we're talking about entities like Azure Government, for instance, or an organization that has a private cloud. Those are the cloud service providers. So don't think of CSP as like in Microsoft world, we're CSP providers, for instance, cloud service providers. It's not the same. This is really talking about the larger entities. And so it's like an Amazon. And so other types of Dell Tech has their own private cloud. Different folks have those. That's what a CSP is. And what they did is they also kind of define what the CSP in terms of SP 800-145, and they basically really kind of clarified it. The other change that they actually had in terms of the assessment scope. And they really be clear what the assessment scope is. It's basically trying to really set of all assets in the OSA, the organization seeking a certification environment that will be assessed against the security requirements. So they made it much more tighter what it was. So that's basically any entity that wants to get CMC certification is going to have an assessment scope around what they're trying to look for in terms of what they want to get a certification against. What they also did, if you're a large company, you may have an option that does your security management. The agility is that must process, store, or transmit of assets that have CUI. Remember the process, store, or transmit. Those are key, and that's the whole in terms of what we have for CMC. And when you look at the organization, you look at various pieces on it. Well, they different things, like in the CUI program, they have security protection data, for instance, and definition more and more of these definitions that you'll see. And the key rule that you have to think about from your standpoint is you have to look at your or enhancement CUI, and that's kind of the key. The other change that they actually had in terms of the provisioning is they came up in terms of a new classification for not applicable. And this is really so you met, not met, and not applicable. They didn't have this before. And where this comes in impact is that if you're building an archive, for instance, an enclave, for instance, I misspoke. An enclave, for instance, you would not necessarily have Wi-Fi access in an enclave because it's all cloud-based. So before, you would actually have to go through and justify what you had to do when you go through assessment, like what we did. But now you have a non-applicable standard that you can actually apply to it because there is no Wi-Fi associated with it. It's just like in this example, public access separation system. If you have a public system that's not integrated into your enclave, it's not applicable. So you now have a method, and they also define with not applicable that it's an automatic grant of the points in the category, because we're talking about that grant from a scale of 110. Now, the big change they did was this one right here, which they call security protection asset. What they had previously is they linked it to, that was security protection asset was defined anything that would basically use to process security information. And also the way they word it, so that means if you use any tool, like as an MSP, for instance, if we had our own custom tool, then we use security protection asset, then we would be kind of incorporated as part of that under your CMC umbrella. The way the changes are, they stripped it out, so they basically scoped it so there's not a linking to supported services. And the way it was happening is that you could just link indefinitely, so you find everyone in the food chain that would provide security protection asset. Now, what they did associated with this is that they made it so it's really a single level type term. So if you have for example, what this means, let's say you're running a antivirus, for instance, and you're in GCC high. So you're using the Defender P2, for instance, and managing. So that would be an SPA asset. But what that SPA asset is all it's containerized into your GCC high tenant. Now, if you took that and ran it from, let's say, a third party and using an SPA, then that's a different issue because there are other questions that you have to answer. Does it transmit, process, or store CUI? If the answer is yes, then it's going to be in scope. So the questions you always ask with anything, with any asset you have is, does it process, transmit, process, or store CUI? Now, what they did do in terms of this update, Title 32, they came up with another term called security protection data. So now you have really two parts of it. You have security protection asset, but let's say your security protection asset is used by an outsourced entity, and that actually grabs and stores their data into their environment, then that would be classified as a security protection. So you're looking in terms of how you actually handle it and where data is kept. Like in a case, one of the things that we did when we went through for our CMC certification, we're doing in January, and we're doing through our pretest, we have a security data tool we use for our checks and balances. That would be considered an in-scope asset because it has snapshots of the security logs and everything else that we kept. And so that's how they actually handle it. So that would have to be CMC, or it's going to be FedRAMP moderate, really depending or separate FedRAMP equivalents, really depending the structure, the way the software is built. So, but again, the real question you ask on this one, where is the security data kept? And it's really very clear. They're talking about it's basically includes, and the magic term, but is not limited to, which means that if it touches it and you store it somewhere, then it's going to be an in-scope. And so you have to pay attention to that aspect. They clarified out-of-scope assets be really clear. They cannot process, store, transmit CUI. They can be physically, logically separated from the information system. So they had to really kind of clear some of the pieces. Now, for the folks that are doing enclaves, like we have an issue for ourselves, the way our GCC high tenant and the way our clients work, we build enclaves for them. Enclaves is a really interesting thing because the question is, you're using VDI, a virtual desktop interface, to actually access that. So what they did in terms of DoD when they did the comment section, they basically defined VDI assets. And so basically a VDI client configuration to not allow any processing, storage, or transmit FCI or CUI beyond the keyboard, video, mouse that's sent to the VDI client, which now means that you could have a laptop, like my laptop in my office. I can use a VDI interface. If I have the necessary security controls on it, then that basically blocks everything except keyboard, video, and mouse. Then that would be my laptop would be an out-of-scope asset. If I set it up so my VDI interface that I could print locally, or I could actually share data, then that would be an in-scope asset. So that's kind of interesting on the pieces on it. Now, the other piece that they had, which is they put a statement in there, was buried in one of the other documents on data retention, what C3POs have. And what we have right here is basically when they're talking about the data being the C3PO, when you actually do a certification, for instance, the C3PO are required to basically retrain assessment artifacts, which by definition means the organization seeking certification is going to be required to keep them. They have a requirement to keep it for 6 years. So what this really means for you, for all of us, is that we have to look at what tools that we actually use to actually manage and generate our SSP. How do we actually generate changes to the SSP? Because now when you look in terms of data retention, every time we go for certification, just like when we go for a change, let's say we update our SPUR score, that's going to require a new SSP. Whenever we do that, we're going to have to make sure we have the artifact retention. So the strategy of how you actually manage that is going to be crucial. As an example, for us, we use FutureFeed as our GRC tool. So now we have snapshots of SSPs, and we're going to have to make sure that on our team sites, that when we build our artifacts, we're going to have snapshots of data every time we generate our changes on it through our change control board. So you have to understand what this really means in terms of the pieces and everything else and what the impact is. But those are kind of the key ones. And, we'll have some time for questions afterwards, but address it. But it really comes down to the really 3 statements. And I have kind of a quick summary of change that you need to do to keep yourself out of trouble. But you got to think of everything about, does it process, store, or transmit CUI? That's crucial. An example, if you're using a third-party mail filter and you may get CUI through the mail, then suddenly that third-party mail filter would be in scope because it process, transmits, or it basically meets the test. One of the criteria is a process, transmit, or store CUI. Now, what didn't change in terms of CMMC, they've been very clear in terms of CMC R2. It's 1-800-171-R2. They still have the 3 levels. They have additional information on the tables and structures of things in scope or out of scope. You can do self-assessment for level 2, but the requirements, even reading through the DoD, it's a 470-page document. They're talking about, you can actually do your self-assessment, but you do self-assessment, you're going to have to do it annually. But the issues associated with it is that you'll probably end up going to be forced into a full assessment somewhere down the line, because it's going to be talk about the quality and is your business up to the controls and everything associated with it. So what are the 3 rules that we came out with? It's really, like I said, it's about, does the asset or tool that you use process, store, or transmit CUI? That is really the crucial part of it. The second piece that you have to ask about everything that you have in your environment is, where is the security data stored? And this is important because that means it has to be on a FedRAMP moderate or equivalent service. And that when the terms of the data is very structured. So for example, if you have it in Azure Government and everything is built in Azure Government, you're inheriting all the Microsoft in terms of FedRAMP certification. You're inheriting all those processes. So you basically inherit all those shared responsibilities. So you're meeting these requirements. And then the other question you have to ask yourself is, how are you planning to meet the 6-year retention requirement? And the retention requirement is more about how you're going to manage data and manage the change process in your organization. Because a C3PO is going to have, they're going to have snapshots of point in time. But when you come up for certification, like even for ours, what our C3PO, when we did our pre-certification came through, they wanted to see our snapshots of all our SSPs that we actually generated, to see that we had the maturity of the processes in place and how we changed. So that's a lot of things you have to, so always, these are kind of the 3 big takeaways that I look at. I mean, there's a lot of others, but it's really, you've got to answer these questions with everything that you have. And there's other configuration information associated with the, with the government posted spec that they posted on last Friday. So it gives you an idea of the pieces. Those are where is that really you have 2 organizations, like you're talking about CMC level 2, you're going to be in Azure Government. It's a different data center. It's not physical. It's a physically different environment than commercial. Don't think that you're commercial, you're going to meet the requirements of CMC level 2. I mean, there's some folks that say you will, some folks who say you won't. The issue is going to come down to, do you store, process, or transmit CUI? And if you're doing that, you have basically, there's requirements in terms of where the data is being stored and who has access into it. And the problem with the commercial side is that it's global US support, it's global support, and not all applications are in sovereign US, where in GCC High and Azure Government is sovereign US. It's like, for example, thinking about this, the comment, store, process, or transmit CUI, we actually build out clients' tenants that have KAMIND build out. We provision both Azure subscription for you and a GCC High subscription. We purposely build out the Azure subscription in the client's tenant. So it's basically completely owned by the organization, because the Azure subscription process controls and transmits CUI. And what's happened a lot of times, people would say they'll build out Azure, there'll be an Azure enterprise agreement, and they'll sign sub-agreements to different people. And so you may have a sub-agreements on a larger enterprise enrollment. If you have that, what happens is that the entity, the organization that actually supplying you the Azure, has now placed themselves in they are an in-scope asset. And they will have to have CMMC requirements placed on them, because they control, process, and store CUI. That's what Azure subscriptions do. So they have to be really careful. There's a lot of things you need to look at in your organization when you look at the pieces. In terms of the roadmap, in terms of CMC deployment, still the same, no changes associated. You just have a new category of a not applicable that you can actually use. This is the Microsoft CMC Technical Reference Manual, and basically the placemat. And they'll be doing an update associated with it. There's some minor tweaks, but it's really nothing significant. And when you look at enclave design, for instance, the big change here is that you really need to look at, you're going to have a VDI interface. Otherwise, if you don't have a VDI in this picture that I actually had over here, what would happen is this guy, if this is a VDI interface, then that means the hardware would not be in scope. If this is not a VDI interface, then this has to be tied into this environment, because it would be an in-scoped asset. So you have to really think about how you want to put the pieces together. And so you're really getting the various pieces on it. where's your security protection assets? Are they really contained in a Azure Gov environment? If they contain your organization. Then maybe you run in a situation where you start looking at terms of where the pieces go, because the SPA is one piece, but the security protection data is another piece. Like what we do, for instance, we use a GRC tool for feature feed to actually manage how we manage our system security plan, how we manage our policy and procedures and everything else. But we also have to make sure that as we build that, we have to have basically in our team site in the GCC High, we have to have the document evidence. We have to make sure we have the pieces associated with her and to keep those in place. So you have to think about how you're going to manage data and how you're going to store it, because if the C3POs have retention, you know what's going to happen. They're going to request the material be stored as well. So you have to have retention for this as well. So there's byproducts of everything you do. And then you have the other aspect saying, if you're going to do the backup recovery, where are you storing your backups? Well, you're probably going to put them in case for us in Azure Gov, we're going to have those things in Azure Government, because we want to inherit from the Microsoft to minimize the costs and overhead associated with it. And we also, what we do in order to actually generate some of our artifacts, and there's different tools to do this. Ours is Guard Plus, for instance, that we actually go through and basically generate the necessary artifact to prove the point in times that we're doing what we're supposed to do, that we have that proof of execution on it. So these are the things you have to really worry about when you actually look at how the environment pulls together and what you want to do for next. And again, how you actually do this, it's going to be a continuous process. So you need to also think about the security model. How's the security model happening? How's the MSP or that you're managing? Are they doing a continuous process model in terms of handling it? And keep in mind, when you start doing continuous process model, you're doing CMC, you're doing NIST 800, 171, R2, you're going to have a change control board. So as you go through processing, you're remediating pieces, stuff that you need to tweak in the organization, you're going to generate new artifacts, you're going to generate a new SSP. So it's not just a point in time, it's going to be consistent changes as you put things in place. So that gives you kind of the nutshell update of what's going on with Title 32. So the real question you have, I'm going to open up for some questions, is really how is the best way to approach it? And how you want to do it is that you got to basically, if you had a gap assessment done, you need to basically talk to whoever did your gap assessment, and you're going to have to do a refresh under the new rules and make sure that some things are appropriate. And it's not that significant. It's going to be more tweaks of what's not applicable, what's not applicable. You're going to have to look at something like we have Guard Plus. There's other tools you look at. We use that to basically evaluate the security posture. And basically that gives you the ability to look in terms of what's going on. The problem you have in terms of the security environment, it's almost any environment that you have, is the amount of data that you actually have to go through, the amount of screens you look for, different dashboards. I mean, you're talking millions of events, and what happens a lot of times is that you get kind of Jada is not, probably you heard that too much before, but you get this view that there's so much information, you can't see the individual trees in the forest. You just see this big glob. That's why we created Guard Plus, because when we started dealing with millions and millions and tens of millions of events, you have to basically simplify it out and get that picture of what's going on. And, CMC level 2, you're going to be in GCC High. And you need the Azure subscription. They both work together, and that's kind of crucial on it, because the Azure subscription has to be implemented in such a way that it's a CUI asset and it's basically created in your government tenant. It can't be created in a partner tenant and given to you, because then that partner tenant that creates that CUI subscription would be an in-scope asset, which is really not what you want to have happen. So anyway, so give ourselves a call, more information. We've got a couple of things. We're going to have an open for questions. We have a Guard Plus guide, and it's a printed document. So if you're interested in any copy of that, we'll give you, it's a pretty full document in terms of what it has and the capabilities on it. just give us feedback on it and put your name and address associated, and we'll get one of these things out to you. And with that, I'd like to open up for questions to see what questions folks have.
Matt, one of the questions that I've seen, and I don't know how to deal with this, is third-party service providers. Do they need to be CMMC Level 2 compliant?
Well, that's a good question, because when you look at there's been a lot of discussion in the DoD documents. It comes down to that question: does that third-party service provider process, store, or transmit CUI? That's really the crucial faction. So if you had a third-party service provider in the environment, and basically all their assets and everything else they're using were contained in that environment, they don't need to, basically, the way that's currently being written on the revised rules, they don't need to be certified. But the point that they actually say, bring data over into their environment, bring security data in those environment, those assets become in scoped. So it gets in this model where if you have third-party service providers in your environment, does the organization seeking certification basically supply them with computing hardware or the other type to basically manage the environment so the assets are controlled?
Yeah, thanks. So I was looking specifically for like Mimecast or Barracuda, or even really simple SendGrid.
Oh, well, those are good questions as well, because what happens is it goes back to the original discussion. You have does it store, process, or transmit CUI? In the case of let's say Barracuda or Mimecast, which are basically spam filters, if you're going to receive CUI over email and they're going to process through those devices, then those would be in-scoped assets, the way the rules are currently written for SBA, because it's store, process, or transmit. Barracuda or Mimecast would actually transmit CUI because they go from one source to another.
Hmm.
SendGrid is an interesting one. It comes down to what SendGrid is being used for. If SendGrid is being used for moving security protection assets about, let's say security data or let's say using for just notices, go log in, and that's just very limited function. The questions you ask again: does SendGrid store, process, or transmit CUI? And in the case of sending like a login, the answer is no.
Okay.
And when you look at pieces, that's where you have to apply the terminology. You have to apply the rules for it. You also need to keep in mind that they also expanded the definition in terms of security protection devices, security protected data, SPD, to include password storage vaults. So now you have to deal, if you're using third parties, like we use Keeper, for instance, we have to have a special version of Keeper for government that basically meets the requirement of an SPD.
Thank you.
Let's see, do we have any other questions?
Well, I did have another one. I didn't want to hog it all up. So I've got an Azure tenant, uh, and I know I need to get to the Gov tenant. So is there anything special I need to do with that subscription? So inside to make it compliant?
Yeah, it comes down to where the subscription was created. So an Azure subscription, the way Azure works, just to make sure everyone understands the same page, is when you actually, the way it works in the government tenants is, and it works different with a commercial tenant. Commercial tenant partners have the ability to basically go provision an Azure subscription that's built, and it's based on the partner tenant creation, because a partner is the enrollment entity. So that's the way it works in the commercial side. On the government side, it's a little bit different. When you do a Azure subscription in government, you get an enrollment ID, and it's up to the partner, the provider of the Azure enrollment ID. is to go create the subscription. So if you actually create the subscription, and it's been I'd say traditionally what people used to do a lot is they would have one enrollment ID and sell sub-subscriptions off that so they can have their own price margin markup associated with it, and have one billing. And so if they have that if your provider used that model, then they would be an in-scoped asset. What you have to actually do is under the enrollment is you have to set up a special user account in the Azure government in the GCC High tenant and have that user account create the Azure subscription. So the Azure subscription resides in the government tenant that's for the organization seeking certification, the OSC. Because Azure subscription would be an in-scoped asset because it has CUI, because it stores, process, and transmit CUI by definition. So you have to be very careful on that. So to answer your question, you can't have a commercial Azure subscription and use that in the government side. You have to have a government subscription where the subscription's created in the GCC High tenant that's unique to that namespace. And if you had the situation where you have commercial and you don't have the government, then you go purchase a government one, and they're going to have to move all the assets over from the commercial to the government, which will be a challenge because you're in two different data centers.
Thank you.
Is there any other questions that folks have? If not, I'm going to thank you very much for your time today, and we'll give you 15 minutes back. And yeah, I mean, take a look at the docs are really super interesting to go read. Bedtime reading is 500 pages of comments, but it actually is very interesting to look in terms of what the comments are and what the responses are. And the DoD responses are very well thought out and have done a lot for clarity. So keep in mind the 3 rules I said. If it stores, transmit, or process CUI, then it's going to be in-scope asset. Keep track where your security protection data is located, because that's going to define if it's in scope or out of scope and need to be scope of services. So you have to look through all those various pieces. And if there's anything else you have, please go sign up for we'll give you a mailing of the Guard Plus brochure that give you an idea. So just drop your information in terms of www.kamind.com/feedback. And thanks again for your time. And you guys, everyone have a great rest of the day.